Elderly millionaire pretends to be poor and finds the love of his life. Richard Thornton, an elderly millionaire who had once basked in the glory of his success, now found himself disillusioned with the life his wealth had built. At 68, Richard owned sprawling estates, luxurious cars, and a thriving business empire, but none of it brought him joy. Loneliness had crept in, and the superficial friendships he once cherished now felt hollow. One day, after another tiresome gala where people fawned over his fortune rather than his company, Richard made a decision. He would step away from his life of wealth, shedding the image of an untouchable tycoon, and experience the world as an ordinary man. He longed to know if there were people who could see him for who he was, not for the money that defined him. His plan was simple, yet bold. Disguising himself in worn-out clothes and leaving behind his luxury, Richard moved into a small apartment in a quiet town. With a fake name, he took up modest work at a local cafe, blending into the lives of ordinary people. It was there, in the midst of brewing coffee and sweeping floors, that Richard met Claire, a middle-aged woman with a heart of gold and a smile that lit up the room. Claire's life had been anything but easy, yet she carried herself with grace and kindness. She treated everyone equally, including Richard, whom she believed was just a kind, struggling old man. Richard was captivated by her sincerity. Little did he know, this chance meeting would lead to a love that would change his life forever. Richard Thornton had spent decades at the top, building his empire and earning the respect and envy of his peers. Yet, as the years passed, he realized that his wealth had become both a shield and a barrier. People only saw his money, not the man behind it. At 68, with no close family and few genuine friends, Richard yearned for connection, something real and untainted by his fortune. One evening, while staring out at the glittering cityscape from his penthouse, Richard made a life-altering decision. He would trade his identity as a millionaire for a simpler, more anonymous life. Over the next week, he meticulously prepared his plan. He withdrew a modest amount of cash, rented a small, run-down apartment in a quiet town, and filled his wardrobe with second-hand clothes. For the first time in decades, Richard felt a sense of excitement and uncertainty as he left behind the trappings of his wealth. The town of Willow Creek was far removed from the high society Richard was used to. It was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, and everyone pitched in during hard times. Richard took up the name Rick and found a part-time job at a cozy cafe, owned by a warm-hearted couple who welcomed him without question. He swept floors, brewed coffee, and served customers with a humble smile. Though the work was physically demanding, Richard found solace in its simplicity. It was during one of his shifts that he first met Claire. Claire was a woman in her late 40s, with a soft demeanor and a quiet strength that immediately caught Richard's attention. She was a regular at the cafe, often stopping by after her shift as a nurse at the local clinic. Claire had an unassuming beauty, her auburn hair often tied in a loose bun, her hands calloused from years of hard work, and a radiant smile that seemed to make everything brighter. Unlike many of the patrons, who barely glanced at Rick, Claire always greeted him warmly. "How's your day going, Rick?" she'd ask, her voice filled with genuine interest. She treated him with kindness and respect, never once looking down on him despite his apparent modest circumstances. For the first time in years, Richard felt seen, not as a millionaire or a businessman, but as a person. He found himself looking forward to Claire's visits, their conversations, becoming the highlight of his day. Claire too seemed to enjoy their chats. She told him stories about her patients, her late husband, and her dreams of starting a small community garden for the town. As days turned into weeks, Richard's admiration for Claire grew. She was compassionate, hardworking, and unpretentious, the kind of person who gave without expecting anything in return. But as his feelings deepened, so did his guilt. How could he continue to build a connection with her when he was hiding the truth about who he was? As the weeks turned into months, Richard and Claire's bond grew stronger. Their conversations at the cafe became a daily ritual. Claire would share anecdotes about her work, often light-hearted, but occasionally heartbreaking, and Richard found himself opening up about his past life as a struggling entrepreneur. He avoided mentioning his wealth, but spoke truthfully about the loneliness and regret that had plagued him for years. Claire, in turn, spoke about her late husband Daniel, who had been a firefighter. She told Richard how Daniel's sudden death had left her to raise their son Michael alone. "He was my rock," Claire said one afternoon, her voice tinged with sadness. "Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. But Michael gave me a reason to keep going." Richard admired Claire's resilience. Her ability to endure hardship without losing her warmth and kindness made her even more extraordinary in his eyes. But his feelings also brought a growing sense of dread. He knew that every moment spent with Claire was built on a lie. Sooner or later, she would discover the truth, and Richard feared it would shatter the trust they had built. One day, Richard decided to take a bold step. Claire had mentioned her dream of starting a community garden, but lamented the lack of funds to make it a reality. Without revealing his true identity, Richard anonymously donated a substantial amount to a local non-profit that supported small community projects. Within weeks, the garden was approved, and construction began in the heart of Willow Creek. When Claire found out, she was overjoyed. "This means so much to me," she told Richard, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Whoever made this happen has no idea how many lives they're going to touch." Richard smiled, his heart swelling with pride. But as he watched Claire's excitement, the weight of his secret grew heavier. He wanted to be honest with her, to tell her that he was the one behind the garden, and much more. Yet, every time he tried, fear held him back. Meanwhile, the people of Willow Creek began to notice the deepening connection between Richard and Claire. The cafe owners teased him, calling Claire his special customer, and even Claire's son, Michael, remarked on how often his mother talked about Rick. Richard cherished these moments, but couldn't shake the feeling that his time in Willow Creek was running out. He knew he couldn't live this double life forever. The turning point came when Darren, one of Richard's old business associates, unexpectedly showed up in Willow Creek. Darren had been trying to contact Richard for weeks, unaware of his decision to leave his old life behind. Spotting Richard in his humble disguise at the cafe, Darren was initially confused, then amused. "Rick? Really?" Darren said, smirking as he leaned against the counter. "What's this, some kind of social experiment?" Richard pulled Darren aside, his voice low and urgent. "Keep your voice down. No one here knows who I really am." Darren laughed. "What's the point of hiding? These people wouldn't care about you if they knew the truth." "That's exactly why I'm hiding," Richard shot back. "For once, I want to be seen for who I am, not what I have." Darren shook his head, clearly unimpressed. Suit yourself, but this little charade won't last forever. Richard's worst fears came true a week later when Darren, in a fit of drunken mischief, let slip at the cafe that Rick was actually Richard Thornton, one of the wealthiest men in the country. The revelation spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. People who had once treated Richard as an equal began to approach him with awkward smiles and probing questions about his wealth. But the one person he cared about most, Claire, didn't come to see him at all. Richard knocked on Claire's door that evening, his heart pounding. When she finally answered, her expression was a mix of hurt and betrayal. "So it's true," she said, her voice trembling. "You've been lying to me this whole time." "I never meant to hurt you," Richard began, his voice thick with emotion. "When I came here, I was tired of people only seeing my money. I wanted to live a simple life, to find something real. And then I met you." Claire crossed her arms, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And you thought lying to me was the best way to do that?" "I didn't know how to tell you," Richard admitted. "The more time I spent with you, the more I realized how much I cared about you. But I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently." Claire's voice softened, but the pain was still evident. "The truth isn't what hurts, Richard. It's the fact that you didn't trust me enough to share it." In the days that followed, Richard tried everything to make amends. He wrote letters, left flowers at Claire's door, and even helped with the community garden in the hopes of earning back her trust. But Claire kept her distance, needing time to process the betrayal. Richard, determined not to give up, made one final gesture. He hosted a town hall meeting at the garden, inviting everyone in Willow Creek. Standing before the crowd, he shared his story, his reasons for coming to their town, his desire to find meaning beyond wealth, and his deep regret for deceiving them. "I came here as Rick because I wanted to escape the life I had built," Richard said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within him. "But what I found was so much more than I expected. I found a community that welcomed me, people who treated me like family. And I found Claire, who showed me what it means to truly care about someone." Turning to Claire, who stood at the back of the crowd, he added, "I know I've broken your trust, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm asking for a second chance, not as Richard Thornton, the millionaire, but as Rick, the man who fell in love with you." The crowd fell silent, all eyes shifting between Richard and Claire, as his heartfelt confession hung in the air. Claire stood at the back of the gathering, her expression unreadable. For Richard, the weight of her gaze felt heavier than the scrutiny of the entire town. This was the moment of truth. He had laid his heart bare, and now everything rested on her response. Slowly, Claire stepped forward, her movements measured and deliberate. The crowd parted to let her through, their whispers fading into an expectant hush. When she reached the front, she stopped a few feet from Richard, her eyes searching his face. "You say you came here to find something real," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And you found it. But instead of trusting me, you let your fear dictate your actions. Do you have any idea how that feels?" Richard lowered his head, guilt radiating off him. "I do now," he said quietly, "and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life. But I meant every word I said tonight. You changed me, Claire. You made me see the emptiness of the life I was living, and showed me what truly matters. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve." The crowd held its collective breath as Claire considered his words. Finally, she spoke, her tone softer now. "Do you know why I came to this garden today, Richard?" He shook his head, daring to meet her eyes. "Why? Because despite everything, I wanted to believe that you were the man I thought you were. The man who worked hard, who listened, who cared. And tonight, you showed me that man again." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "Does that mean—" Claire held up a hand, silencing him. "It means that forgiveness isn't something I can give overnight. But I'm willing to take it one day at a time, if you are." A ripple of relief passed through Richard, and a tentative smile broke across his face. "One day at a time," he echoed. "I can do that." The crowd erupted into applause, a mixture of joy and support for the couple. Richard, however, kept his focus solely on Claire. "Thank you," he said, his voice full of gratitude, "for giving me a chance." Claire nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Don't waste it." Over the next few weeks, Richard devoted himself to proving his sincerity. He continued working at the cafe and volunteering at the garden, not because he had to, but because he genuinely enjoyed being part of the community. Claire remained cautious, but allowed him back into her life, slowly rebuilding the trust they had lost. Richard also made amends with the town, helping to fund improvements to the community center and supporting local businesses. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt like a tool for good, rather than a measure of his worth. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Richard invited Claire to the garden. They walked among the blooming flowers in comfortable silence, the air between them warm and peaceful. Stopping at the center of the garden, Richard turned to Claire, his heart racing. "There's one more thing I want to say," he began. Claire raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Richard took her hands in his voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to spill over. "I may have come to Willow Creek, pretending to be someone else, but the man standing before you now is the truest version of me. And that's because of you. Claire, you've given my life meaning in a way I never thought possible. I don't want to live another day without you by my side." From his pocket, Richard pulled out a simple but elegant ring. "Will you marry me? For real this time?" Claire's breath caught, her eyes welling with tears. She looked at Richard, seeing not the wealthy tycoon who had entered her life under false pretenses, but the kind, humble man she had grown to love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I will." As Richard slipped the ring onto her finger, the people of Willow Creek, who had quietly gathered nearby, burst into cheers. The couple embraced, surrounded by the warmth and love of the community that had brought them together. The engagement of Richard and Claire quickly became the talk of Willow Creek. But unlike the grandiose celebrations Richard was accustomed to in his old life, the couple opted for a simple ceremony that reflected the love they had built on trust, growth, and shared values. The entire community came together to help organize the wedding, contributing flowers, food, and decorations in a show of unity and support. On a crisp autumn afternoon, under the golden canopy of the community garden, Richard and Claire exchanged vows. The garden, now a thriving oasis of color and life, symbolized their journey, starting from something humble and growing into something beautiful with care and effort. As they stood hand in hand, Claire looked into Richard's eyes and said, "You've taught me that even in the most unexpected places, love can bloom. You're not the man I first met, Richard, and for that, I'm grateful. Today, I promise to love you for the person you've become and for the man you're still striving to be." Richard's voice was steady, though his eyes shimmered with tears. "Claire, you've given me a gift I never thought I'd find. Purpose. You've shown me that life isn't measured by wealth, but by the love we give and the lives we touch. I promise to honor you, cherish you, and grow with you every day." When the ceremony concluded, the cheers of their friends and neighbors echoed through the garden, a reminder of the new family Richard had found in Willow Creek. After the wedding, Richard fully embraced his life in the town. He sold off parts of his business empire, redirecting the funds to create scholarships, healthcare programs, and community development projects. The Thornton Initiative, as it came to be known, became a beacon of hope for struggling families across the region. Claire continued her work as a nurse, though she also became a prominent figure in the community for her leadership in the garden project. Together, she and Richard hosted events, mentored young people, and worked tirelessly to give back to the town that had given them so much. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their modest home, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, Claire turned to Richard with a smile. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "And the penthouse, the luxury?" Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Not for a second. I've gained far more here than I ever had in all those years of wealth and status." Claire leaned against him, her voice soft. "And to think it all started with a little deception." Richard wrapped his arm around her, a wry smile on his face. "A little deception, yes, but it led me to the greatest truth of my life. You. Do you believe in second chances? What would you do if someone you loved made a mistake but worked to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective.